This video is brought to you by Brilliant. With NATO's annual summit less than a couple of weeks away, the big question on the agenda is, unsurprisingly, when and if Ukraine should be admitted into the bloc. Ukraine's potential NATO membership has been a hot topic for some time now, but with crunch time fast approaching, two schools of thought have emerged. Eastern Europe and France want a membership action plan, while others, especially the US and Germany, don't want to provide concrete guarantees. So in this video, we're going to have a look at how NATO-Ukraine relations have developed over time, the splits between various NATO members on the question of Ukraine's membership, and what's actually likely to happen. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a history of Ukraine-NATO relations. Ukraine's attitude towards NATO has fluctuated depending on the administration. Ukraine's politics has oscillated between relatively pro-Russian presidents, who were usually more popular in the east of Ukraine, and relatively pro-Western presidents, who are usually more popular in the west of the country. Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, was pretty pro-Western and pro-NATO. He was vocally opposed to the Russian-led security structures that succeeded the Warsaw Pact, and once even said that NATO membership would be, quote, the best guarantee to Ukraine's security. He joined NATO's North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1991, the Partnership for Peace programme in 1994, and signed a partnership agreement with the EU a few months later. Ukraine's second president, Leonid Kuchma, was more pro-Russian and especially popular in Donbass and Crimea. While Kuchma retained relatively good relations with NATO, in 2004 he said that Ukraine no longer aspired to join either NATO or the EU, presumably to keep Putin happy. After a controversial election in 2004, where Orange Revolution protesters forced the runoff to be rerun due to allegations of corruption and vote falsification, Kuchma was succeeded by Viktor Yushchenko. Yushchenko was relatively pro-Western and more popular in the western parts of Ukraine. In 2005, Yushchenko announced that Ukraine wanted to join both the EU and NATO, and in 2008 he officially requested a membership action plan, which provides aspiring NATO members with concrete accession criteria. As a roadmap to accession, if a country gets a membership action plan, that basically means it's going to join NATO. Ukraine's application sparked a debate within the bloc. The US and Eastern European countries were keen to give Ukraine a membership action plan, but France and Germany were wary of annoying Russia. In the end, NATO agreed to a sort of fudge. Ukraine didn't get a membership action plan, but then Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer said Ukraine, as well as Georgia, would eventually become members. Yushchenko was then succeeded by relatively pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, who, you guessed it, was more popular in the east. Yanukovych distanced Ukraine from NATO and the EU, and his sudden decision in late 2013 to ditch the EU's association agreement in favour of a generous loan from Russia sparked the Maidan Revolution. After parliamentary elections in October 2014, which occurred in the context of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and escalating involvement in Donbass, the new government, led by Petro Poroshenko, made joining NATO a priority. This is when NATO-Ukraine relations became a bit more complicated. While Ukraine, under first Poroshenko and then Zelensky, has been keen on joining, NATO has been understandably wary of accepting a country that's at war with Russia. Ukraine-NATO relations have since been stuck in a sort of cycle. Every time Russia threatens Ukraine, NATO refuses to actually let Ukraine in. But NATO members instead step up military support for Ukraine, and Russia reacts by escalating, restarting the cycle. NATO first stepped up its support for Ukraine in the 2010s, with the intention that Ukraine's military be interoperable with NATO by 2020. Partly as a reaction to what Putin saw as NATO expansion in Ukraine, Russia started amassing troops on Ukraine's border in early 2021. At the 2021 annual summit in NATO, NATO said again it wouldn't provide a membership action plan to Ukraine, but still increased its military support. After Putin invaded Ukraine in February last year, NATO once again said that, obviously, they couldn't admit a country that was fighting a full-on war with Russia, but instead massively stepped up material support. However, over a year into the war, with NATO countries having spent over €65 billion in military aid for Ukraine, and leaks Pentagon documents proving that NATO has nearly 100 personnel operating in Ukraine, certain countries in NATO, including most notably France, are arguing that it's time to end this loop and finally provide Ukraine with a membership action plan. The clamour for clarity on Ukraine's NATO prospects has grown ahead of the bloc's annual summit, due to be held in Vilnius on July the 11th and 12th. As we see it, there are basically two schools of thought emerging. No country is really advocating for immediately bringing Ukraine into NATO, as NATO's self-defence clause in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty would require NATO to commit to a full-on war against Russia. But some NATO members think it's time for a membership action plan, or at least some concrete conditions for Ukraine's membership. Macron, for example, has said that he thinks it's time for a, quote, clear path towards membership. Similarly, Poland and the Baltics have demanded an actual timetable for Ukraine's accession, arguing that further dilly-dallying will only embolden Russia and encourage Putin to prolong the conflict, and that a concrete timetable might even scare Russia out of Ukraine. On the other side of the aisle, more dovish NATO members, including most notably the US and Germany, don't want to provide an actual timetable with concrete criteria for accession. Biden said he wouldn't, quote, make it easy for Ukraine to join NATO, and the German Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius, said on Thursday that the door is open a crack, but that it's not the time to decide now. Hungary's Viktor Orban is apparently even less keen on the idea, at least judging by his tweets. It's interesting to note how the roles are reversed compared to 2008, when it was the US arguing for Ukraine's accession and France being reluctant. Anyway, these countries argue that accelerating Ukraine's accession risks provoking Russia into escalation, as it has done historically, and possibly dragging NATO into a full-on war with Russia. The US is probably wary because Biden still has an eye on Asia and Taiwan, and he's aware that further committing to Ukraine might make pivoting to Asia more difficult. Ultimately, the most likely compromise is probably that NATO won't provide a concrete timetable, but a statement saying that, like Finland and Sweden, Ukraine doesn't need a membership action plan to join, which should make the process a bit easier when it happens. It'll then be up to individual NATO members to provide bilateral and trilateral security agreements with Ukraine, which, while obviously welcome from Kyiv's point of view, will still fall well short of NATO's mutual defence clause. Having watched an 8-minute video explaining the complex politics of NATO, it's fair to assume you have a desire to learn and better your knowledge of modern conflicts and global politics. Well, we've got something that you might enjoy and will continue your online educational journey. Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform where you can learn everything from quantum computing or algebra to logical decision making. And if you don't want to learn more about the world from simply just watching YouTube videos, then you're in luck, because Brilliant actually teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. And rather like a good TLDR news video, Brilliant breaks topics down into accessible chunks, which you can work through whenever you have time. There's no homework, there's no deadlines, and there's no core classes. You can spend anything from a few minutes to a few hours a day accumulating new knowledge in an actually fun way. So, whether you want to brush up on your basic math skills, improve your employment prospects by learning about future technologies, or just have fun with coding, you can check out everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days. Click on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.